thrilled to introduce my former VP, but still the current VP of Food Innovation and Technology and Dairy Foods at Land O'Lakes, Joanna Montenegro. Joanna has a huge passion for learning organizations, and prior to her role as VP, Joanna led both strategic technology development and new product development teams. And with that illustrious background, she will be taking us through how Land O'Lakes is successfully innovating in an evolving world and what's next on the horizon for her organization. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Joanna. Thank you so much for being with here today.
Thank you, Allison. Well, hello, everybody. I'm really happy to be here. I think this is a topic that's important. It's very important now, especially. We're kind of going through a bit of some crazy times, as everybody knows. So here's what I had planned on doing. I'm going to share my screen and take you through just a couple of thoughts that I pulled together to talk about how we're thinking about food innovation in the world today, how we have been thinking about food innovation. Give you a little bit of an introduction about myself too before I start into that. But I did also want to make sure that we leave this kind of as conversational as we can. So certainly send questions. I asked Allison to kind of help me with questions that might pop up. I can either answer them live or we can wait a little bit until the end. But let me at least get started with a little bit about myself. So I run the Food Innovation Technology team at Land O'Lakes, and it's essentially like an R&D group, but it's a bit of an expansive perspective on R&D for the dairy foods business at Land O'Lakes. We're really trying to think of ourselves as food innovators more broadly than simply R&D within the organization. And I have an undergraduate in food engineering. I'm Portuguese, and so I came to the United States 22 years ago for my PhD at the University of Minnesota. And I've had different roles in the food industry. I worked at General Mills for the large part of my career, and then the past 7 years I've been at Land O'Lakes, which has been a wonderful place for me to be as well. I did product development, so I was really spent a lot of time in R&D in Yoplait, and I spent a lot of time in R&D in the Pillsbury division when General Mills bought Pillsbury. But then I moved into manufacturing functions, and I spent a little bit less than half of my career in operations and manufacturing. So I saw that side of the world as well. And I had a role in sales for a while, representing technical functions in sales. So I've sort of seen the CPG world from different angles, and I find it fascinating. And now what I'm doing in my career is really team leadership of R&D teams. So let me just give you a little bit of a sense of what FIT, which is Food Innovation and Technology, what our team does and what we're composed of. So we have these different platforms. So we have a team, for example, that focuses on natural cheese as a platform, a team that focuses on processed cheese as a platform, refrigerated desserts, because Cozy Shack Pudding is a brand largely in the New York area, but you'll find it here that we also sell and we innovate around. Obviously, butter and spreads. For those of you that know Land O'Lakes know that we're the butter company, but we're so much more. And then also a specialty powders group. So we actually create, make, sell the Cheetos powder. So the powder that goes into Cheetos and a whole bunch of different seasonings like that are made from cheese powders. And so this team has sort of technical platforms, teams that are technically focused around different product platforms. And they're accountable for innovating around those product platforms. But then we also have capability and skill set platforms, most notably process technology. So you can innovate through process. If you think of a cheese stick versus string cheese, it's cheese, and yet the way in which you made it really made it a different product in a way, right? There's different ways in which you eat it. Some people prefer cheese sticks, some people prefer string cheese. And so process technology is really, really important and critical, particularly in dairy. And then packaging technology, right? If you think of innovation in packaging, and my personal experience having been in Yoplait was I had Go-Gurt. And so yogurt in a tube, suddenly you package something differently and you change. Now it can go in a lunchbox. Now I don't need a spoon. And so packaging could drive a lot of meaningful innovation. And so we have a team like that. We have a couple of research teams. So a food chem, analytical chemistry, a food chemistry group, and a micro group that are starting to do some research, kind of a little bit deeper into dairy, for example, how proteins aggregate in dairy. How do we speed up shelf life, as we're trying to measure shelf life of different products. And so there's a foundation of science going on in the background. And then obviously we have support systems, right? So I have a pilot plant, and then we have a couple of teams. One is called the Spark team. and their role is to help everybody else be more innovative. And so this is actually a very powerful team, a small, powerful team. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the work that they do, how to infuse kind of this entrepreneurial mindset within this team. Because if you think about it, you get a big, CPG company like Land O'Lakes, right? A Fortune 250 company, and General Mills would have the same challenge. Any big company has this challenge where as you sit in these big places, you start to lose touch with the outside world and you lose that entrepreneurial mindset, right? Which frankly, we crave that entrepreneurial mindset and that flexibility. And how am I really going to kind of think outside the box? Because you're walking into a campus. We are by definition the box, right? And so the Spark team really helps try to keep that spirit alive and that muscle exercised for us. And then I have a culinary team where another part of innovation and why we don't want to simply be R&D is if we think about innovation in terms simply of science, what you get out the other end is science. And so if you have chefs on your staff who think about food as a chef thinks about food, now all of a sudden it's a very different way of thinking about what a good idea could look like, of thinking about how you're going to apply this new concept or this new trend out in the world. And so it's been very powerful to sort of include the culinary team as well. So really, sometimes some of the challenge that I have is as people think about R&D, they think about a scientist rather than this sort of real disparate group of skill sets and approaches and ways of thinking about ultimately food on the plate, which is what we're trying to develop and really hit out of the park. So I want to talk a little bit about what the world has looked like and how we innovate in today's world. And these are really the three spaces and platforms that we think about for ourselves. One is the customer expansion. And we were already seeing this before with e-commerce, and you look at Amazon as obviously a typical example, sort of taking over the world of getting stuff to people, right? And a lot of the big retailers are really struggling, right? So Hy-Vee, Walmart, all of these guys know these customers only really need to walk into my store if I have something unique, because if they can order it with Instacart, and again, COVID exacerbated this by a lot, they have no reason to walk in. So the fact that I have this big box is much less interesting unless somehow I'm, for example, Hy-Vee, and I have a very cool specialty cheese section where someone like myself, for example, might think it's fun to go treasure hunting. Then I might go into the store, but otherwise I don't really need to. And this is where precisely, and e-commerce is one of those big spaces where you can be a real small entrepreneur and get your stuff out in front of tons of eyeballs, because you don't need to have that big supply chain like say a Walmart has, because you can have, so long as people have access to the internet, they can order your stuff. And so this really changes the pressure that we would see from customers to say, innovate, 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 because I need to be the one with the one new thing to have someone walk in, because otherwise they're not buying milk from me because they're ordering milk because they know exactly what milk they want. They don't need to walk in my store. So tons of disruption happening in this space. At the same time, you see the channel expansion, right, which is sort of going into, now you have e-commerce saying, yeah, I don't want you to have people go into their space. I have the Walmart people talking to me, and now I have the Amazon people talking to me saying, no. You need to find ways of packaging, selling, shelf life of your stuff that now I can ship this to someone's door. You got to make this easy to ship to someone's door. And so then it has this impact on the portfolio and what are the types of things that we're innovating around? How do we think about what a good new product is going to look like? Because if it's just another flavor of, let's say, spreadable butter, so we have butter with canola oil, butter with olive oil, butter with, we call it the butter with platforms. If it's just another flavor, it's not compelling enough. And so how do you have innovation that's really, really disruptive, that's really going to surprise someone if they're going to see it on a screen, or again, drive all the way to the store to go have access to it if they can't find it online? And so it's a huge challenge to for those of us that have done this for many, many years. The other thing that we're noticing, and is a huge shift, and we've been tracking this for some time because we track how generations are thinking about food. And it's been really attitudes towards food has changed in ways that we haven't seen change in the past. So my entire development career, I knew, You're in your 20s, this is how you think. You're in your 30s, this is how you think. Kids start to show up, this is how you think. And so we kind of knew most generations would follow a trajectory that was fairly predictable. Most generations. Suddenly, the millennials, and now even more with the centennials at average age 16, 17 now, they're not following the same curve that I could predict what they're going to want to do when they start earning this amount anymore. And so attitudes and decisions around food have become way more complex. And so if you look at the gray line here, for the most part, traditionally, taste, price, it's about taste and price. It needs to taste good. And what does it cost? Does it kind of match my expectations? And anything else was a little bit kind of right? The cherry on the cake, but not particularly important. And now what's causing people to make food decisions? Obviously, taste always matters, but source, where did it come from? Is there a sustainability play to this thing that I'm buying? I'm buying this thing, am I doing anything to the environment? It's literally driving decisions. The availability, like, is this something that's easy to get a hold of, or is this something that's coming from some weird country where I feel like there's some ethical issue, right? And so literally driving purchase decisions on shelf to the point of I will not pick this up is a much more complex mindset in this centennial, and some of us still feel it with millennials, right? That is driving whether or not something's compelling to them. And so as a developer and as an innovator, just the tasting good, now you suddenly have this whole surround around everything that you go launch that in some instances is becoming table stakes. That makes it very, very hard to make all of these things intersect. And so one example that we like to use, if you think of sort of what teams like my team do, if you think in blue, there's usually a problem to solve out in the world. And if you think, for example, and I'm going to keep this kind of in the dairy space, if you think, for example, price used to be an issue for butter. Butter was expensive, milk fat was expensive. And so there's technology, hydrogenation that showed up, and now I can make a margarine and I can make butter-like products accessible to people, right? If you think further down the history continuum, shelf stability was something that was important with cheese. If I have a technology called emulsification, so a team like ours that does R&D, right? How do you create a technology that now solves that problem? And now you have processed cheese and there's a shelf stability piece there that's better. Then now when you start to think about, gosh, now my big issue is around values. So for example, I don't like the fact that animals get killed. I don't like the fact that the environment is getting impacted. I don't think that farmers are making anywhere near enough money. So now the problem is a value problem. I want to be vegan. I don't want, right? And so now there's very complex issues. And the way to solve those, so for example, through precision fermentation, now you have the Impossible Foods, Impossible Burger that's a plant-based burger as an example. There's a lot going on in this space around value that really turns on its ear what good innovation looks like in a world where, if I go back to what are the food decisions, it's just a very complicated world. And so good innovation suddenly looks very different, right? So this is kind of the world as we've been having to look at it. So for Land O'Lakes, we've been taking sort of this multifaceted approach to things. And this is where particularly the culinary team and the Spark team work together to help the rest of my entire group start to think about what are the trends, what are the behaviors, and how do I solve these complicated challenges and this decision matrix that's in a consumer's mind to start to get at the right ideas, because there's a ton of ideas, right? But our issue is always, how do I foster the right ideas that are going to answer these questions that are suddenly a lot more complicated than did the thing taste, is this the best yogurt that I could make, right? And so I'm not going to take you through all of these in sort of excruciating detail, but there's a bunch of different ways that we're looking at how we innovate in this world where things have gone, frankly, I think in a fun way upside down, and COVID again exacerbated all of this even more so. But we do things like product challenges, and Allison is actually a part of many of these, where we'll set a challenge for the team, and then we have to practice in groups solving these difficult challenges with a series of degrees of freedom taken away, and like who comes up with the most creative product solution to a challenge. We're obviously out in the world as much as we can, in conferences as much as we can, and to kind of get access to the outside world and listen to the outside world, because again, In bigger Fortune 250 companies, it's easy to get stuck in your own narrative and lose sight of the magic that entrepreneurs tend to hook into, which is what's really going to be relevant out there. And so I really have a lot of admiration for the small entrepreneur who locks in on an idea that is great, right? Because you're seeing something that we have to make sure we're seeing as well. Consumer insights is important. And now we have, fortunately now with the world of Zoom, there's a comfort of accessing people really fast, which we've been able to do really quite well, and ask random people, so long as you have a phone, a question around some challenge, issue, innovation idea, and get real good qualitative but feedback back. That's been really good. We're keeping a lot of tabs on what COVID is doing, and so pandemic buying, as you've seen. I mean, obviously there's the hoarding piece around, hoarding a lot of butter and hoarding a lot of toilet paper and hoarding a lot of things that people kind of do out of a sense of fear. But then there's this, there's a pandemic out there, and I need comfort, and I'm returning to cooking, and I'm returning to, so we're seeing sort of this shift in returning to things that certainly we wouldn't have predicted, a year ago. And so we're keeping a lot of close tabs on what is that doing in terms of trends, because once there's a vaccine and COVID may no longer be dangerous, for example, it doesn't mean that people are going to lose the joy of, I actually quite like that I can cook now, right? So we may see a shift in trends we thought were headed a certain way. We also have these things called innovation days. And so it's different from the product challenge, but where it's more of a stimulus. Let's teach ourselves certain tools. Curiosity was one that I thought was a very good one that we had recently around how do you foster this sense of curiosity, right? So again, keeping that muscle exercised is critical for us. And then obviously we often do these sort of deep dives into what are the attitudes around dairy? Like what is enabling more consumption of dairy? What is preventing more consumption of dairy? And taking, frankly, a really hard look that says, there are things that are coming to disrupt dairy, and how do we feel about those things, right? And really being courageous enough to be able to look at those things and say, I don't know that everybody feels that dairy is a great place to be, that they necessarily want to consume it. Why is that? And how do we make ourselves more appealing in that regard? And then what are things that are going to enable dairy, right? There are folks that feel that dairy proteins are really great, that dairy fat is really great. And so really keeping our pulse on the world's perspective around dairy, since that's really our largest ingredient, it's the most important asset. And so what I would leave you with, before I kind of stop sharing, is I would say the biggest mantra for us needs to be constantly this challenge of looking at things we thought we understood differently, because that's when the blockbusters don't see Netflix coming, right? That's when the Kodaks don't see the camera phone coming, is when you don't really take a good hard look at things that you think you understood when the world's changing as fast as it is. So this is what I think I would leave you all with. Stop sharing. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you so much for that, Joanna. And I would encourage people to put questions in the chat and we can get to those. But to kick off this conversation, obviously, you referenced COVID impacting supply chains and things like that. And the boon in baking, certainly it was a wonderful thing for Land O'Lakes with your butter segment. And I'm curious, I know Land O'Lakes also has a really strong food service industry, and with the incredible shift in people purchasing goods at a grocery store versus at food service, knowing that shift may continue, and hopefully we will see a resurgence of food service and takeaway and other technologies, certainly enabling restaurants and those to continue serving consumers. But thinking about that, I'm curious on the R&D side and the innovation side, how you guys are looking at that space differently moving forward.
Yeah, that was a huge dip, right? And so orders of magnitude, you have a plan that says this is what we're going to sell in food service, and then you start seeing all these restaurants just struggling, right? And all these orders going away. And even if you think of schools, right? Schools don't have lunches anymore. They're trying to do baggies, grab and go. And so the entire thing sort of fell apart for everybody. And I would say that it was difficult for a lot of us to see some of the smaller restaurants that we're supporting, frankly, not making it. And so that was difficult to see. I think part of what we tried to do, though, was for ourselves is use some of the products that were being mostly focused in food service and trying to repurpose some of them into retail a little bit, right? So if we have a really good queso that maybe restaurants should be using, can we find a way to put that in retail for folks to have at home? And so, but a lot of the managing was really around quickly having inventories of stuff and trying to figure out how do I not make that inventory larger, knowing that I'm not going to have orders coming through. And so from a sales standpoint, it was a huge kind of 180 pivot of people that were literally working 12-hour days. From an innovation standpoint, though, it is interesting because obviously I have the benefit of a bit of a longer view as to when we have to deliver stuff, right? But if you're cooking more, do you want that queso now really at home? And it helped us make a case for certain things. And you would mirror a lot of this stuff too, Alison, where, will a consumer want to now use this at home, and how will they think about it? And can we start thinking about ingredients at home and how we can provide ingredients at home in a better way? But yeah, the food service piece was difficult to watch, not just from our standpoint, but even from the people on the other end that are stuck, right? That they don't have people coming in anymore.
Yeah, it's been a hard industry to be in, and hopefully everyone's doing takeout Tuesday and walkout Wednesday and everything to support those restaurants. So when the tide turns in the spring, hopefully, as you mentioned, the vaccine and safety's improved, and we can all continue to enjoy our favorite restaurants. On one of your slides, when you talked about the changing values of what matters to consumers and sustainability, traceability, knowing where their food comes from. For those in the audience, Land O'Lakes is a co-op made up of a large number of dairy farmers. And so I'm curious from an innovation standpoint, if traceability or personalizing, I know Land O'Lakes has done campaigns trying to share more of those farmer stories so people can really see on the ground who is behind the products you guys make, but wondering if there's anything on that side from an innovation standpoint, or QR codes of this is the farm your butter came from, things like that, if that's in the pipeline, or how you guys think about that piece.
Yeah, it is. And it's, I mean, candidly, it's going all the way from that to how do you get to a point where you don't even, and this isn't what we're doing, but what we're watching. How do you get to a point where you're using things like precision fermentation to make milk when there's no cow? And so there's technology out there that's just very, it's disconcerting when you're owned by 9,000, odd farmers, but we're still looking at it to say, that's the extreme of sustainability, where now kind of things you don't need the live animal, you don't need the pesticide, you don't need the antibiotics, you don't need all of that stuff. And now I can make the real product through fermentation. And so it's been done. And there's a product out there. There's an ice cream out there made with whey that didn't come from a cow, but it's real whey. So it's kind of these interesting things that are happening out there that is disconcerting at the same time when you're owned by farmers. But then we have Truterra, and we have all sorts of tools on farm to make sure that we're really, really increasing our sustainability on farm. And working with Nestle. So Nestle, for example, said they're going to be net neutral on carbon footprint on all their dairy. And so we're working with them on how do we do that? How do we use all the data that we have from kind of the feed to the cow to the transportation, and how do we start to impact all that in real ways, right? And our CEO has been actually with the current, with the Biden transition team, trying to figure out how do we best influence that, we can start to make some of these things real. So it's not just like platitudes, right? Not just a thing that you said in a package, but that we're really making an impact there. But it is critical. People are very aware, rightfully so, that we need to make meaningful.
I really admire the view into those fermentation techniques, because like you said, the Polaroids, you don't see it coming for the dairy industry. Obviously you want to be ahead of the curve and know, and how can that maybe become a part of your business? So you were able to pivot and still serve your farmers, still serve your consumers, and offer the best products possible for both people and planet. So that is really awesome to hear. I know, obviously, from a Grow North perspective, we are here to serve entrepreneurs in the food and ag industry, and you have your Spark team. You normally have an entrepreneur in residence, and I'm curious how you guys view acquisitions and small brands and things like that. And people, you know, obviously entrepreneurs are the ones doing the daring things, but you have tremendous scientists on your team who do really core foundational research that, you know, are allowing for different breakthroughs. And I'm wondering how those two spheres kind of combine, and if there are entrepreneurs out there who are interested in technology or products that could fit into your portfolio, how do you want to engage them and move forward?
Oh, I would love to hear from them. Right. I mean, I would love to hear from them because, and it's, we always do look at who's out there, right? And but with several, what I've liked about Land O'Lakes, and I don't know that every company feels this way, but we're thankfully humble enough to know that we're not stellar entrepreneurs, because it's not what we do, right? Again, Fortune 250 big box company. And so there's this is why we have the Spark team, and this is why we stay connected with you guys, which is help us continue to be or get even better at being entrepreneurial, because it's not what we do, and someone else will do that. Now we have the oomph of larger structure, access to stuff, supply chain, things like that. And we try to keep the entrepreneurial mindset, but we know that we're not going to just win this all by ourselves if we just stay in our own little box. And so I would say over the past number of years, we've been trying to open up and make it more of a how do we help each other so we can all win, right? So, and we've purchased a couple of small brands, and we're trying to figure out how we do that even better so that we can provide the best of what we have without squishing the new agile entrepreneurial piece of anything that we have purchased. But we do always have we have a mergers and acquisition playbook, and we have sort of things that we would look for, and maybe things that would surprise us.
In that same vein, I know in the last 10 years, especially as people realize that, you know, small brands are where people are flocking to, and some of the legacy brands were struggling in the industry, and there is kind of a, you know, flash sale of everyone purchasing brands and picking them up to try and bolster their own portfolio, and then realizing often they don't have the core competencies to run those brands, and then having to kind of sell them off in a flash sale to cover debt and things like that. I'm curious, who do you think is doing this well in the industry, and what lessons can you learn internally of, you know, when you look at brands? You talked a little bit about keeping tabs on things and thinking about that. Where do you go, and where do you want to see Land O'Lakes, you know, do better and do more in the space?
This isn't in dairy, but there's a Simple Mills is a small. This is like an almond flour company, fairly small. And I kind of been following them along, and they've been somehow tapping into a space. They do like muffin mix and now they're going into crackers with almond flour, and almond flour is kind of it's a niche, right? It's like a thing. And having worked in Pillsbury for a long time, I noticed, and I would have guessed you'd never want to do that, and yet that's what they're doing, and it's working extraordinarily well. And they're getting into Whole Foods, I think now. I mean, it's working extraordinarily well, and I think what they have is they have this right mix of extremely good products, but they talk about what they care about. They talk about their purpose really, really well, in a believable way. And not just that it needs to be believable, like it really needs to be real, right? And so I've been watching them. How are they getting into a place that I would have thought, again, from my dough experience, would have been very tapped out, and yet they're turning it, that yet looking at it in a different way. And so I think they're doing that really well. I think, to me, if I boil it down to one thing, it's right back to, if you can look at something that you think you understood in a different way, like this is tap water, but I go and I buy a bottle of whatever for Avian for a tremendous amount of money, right? I mean, you can look at things in a different way, and all of a sudden, again, I think it's the companies like Uber, for example, right? That go, I'm gonna have a taxi company. I'm not gonna own any vehicles, or Airbnb that says I'm gonna be a hotel. I'm not gonna own any real estate. You never would have gone into that if you're thinking traditional. I'm gonna go open a hotel, but I'm not gonna own the building. It's simple once it's been said, but there's companies that are doing that, and Simple Mills is doing that with baking mixes, which, again, after having been in Betty Crocker, Pillsbury, right? You just think it's impossible. That is always the danger for bigger companies, is that you just can't look at it differently. I wish you could do that better.
So to your point, hindsight always makes it obvious, and you're like, why didn't I think of that? I'm curious, you have a lot of different platforms at Land O'Lakes, a lot of different product categories. I'm curious, where do you see the most innovation happening from a product category standpoint? And if there's anything exciting, obviously things are always proprietary until they're released, but any teasers you'd like to share with the audience or exciting things coming down that you're really excited to share?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity in cheese that we're trying to figure out. I think there's a lot of opportunity in cheese. And there's a lot of legal definitions around what type of cheese is what kind of cheese. And so we sometimes get locked into this framework that I think if we could break out of from a consumer standpoint, there's a protein health perspective to cheese that we could really unlock in different ways. And I think it's, again, if we can think about it differently, I think there's a lot in cheese that can still come. I think we're trying to figure out how to unlock that. I'm excited about work that we're doing to disrupt stick butter. It's, again, who said stick butter needs to look like stick butter, and how do you disrupt that? And I think that that's the place where consumers go, oh, I know what stick butter is, and now it suddenly is something different that I can intuit. That's work that I think is really exciting, and I think is interesting if we can pull it off in the right way. I'm very excited about that. And then we have some work that's going on more in a technology behind the scenes type of stuff that, when we make butter, we also have skim milk, and then we have to dry it and we sell it as non-fat dry milk, which the global dairy market is an awful place to decide to go make money. And so it's not necessarily a highly profitable stream. And so from the standpoint that we're looking at technology to dry skim milk where you don't use a dryer, so I'm not using an expensive piece of equipment to accomplish something that's essentially a commodity. From a science thermodynamic standpoint is fascinating work. If we can dry skim milk at 1/20th of the cost, I mean, we blow everybody else away. So that's a very cool innovation that would not be consumer, is less CPG-esque, but that's really interesting.
That's really good to hear. I know the skim milk powder was always kind of the bane of the portfolio, and that being subsequent slave to the markets, it was always hard to figure out where best to move that. And in that vein, I'm curious, I know it's oftentimes used as an ingredient or sometimes shipped overseas. Are you seeing any changes in that market or new opportunities, new channels where that byproduct, as you say, that waste stream that can be turned profitable is being used more so, or is there opportunity across the world where moving products can be expensive, but now that there's no water, it's less expensive? And so just curious if you guys have any other developments on that end of the chain as opposed to cost reducing on the front end.
We've thought about it some. It's not been our biggest area of focus because partly it's we end up making so much of it that you'd have to have such a huge, it would have to be, the payout tends to be always a problem. So it's more around how do we just make it the least pain we can make it, the least painful we can make it. And then if you think of things like precision fermentation coming, if an Asian country is using, an African country using non-fat dry milk or fat-filled powders, which is really non-fat dry milk with fat in it, to make their own sort of milk nutrition in country or in continent. If they can use precision fermentation in the backyard, there's no need to ship this stuff from a whole other United States, right? Which is dangerous for us, but there's other technology out there that could seriously disrupt this. I think if we could only make butter and not make powder, right? Right, Allison?
If only. I do miss getting fresh butter all the time. For those out there, there is no more delicious thing than fresh butter, especially right off the line. So I will campaign for getting daily shipments of that. One question, and from the audience, these food product innovations are very intriguing. Will these innovations provide additional price support to dairy farmers? I've seen far too many family dairies close in recent years. So getting profits back to the farmers. Speak more about that.
That's so. Our number one priority always, and that's the CEO's number one priority always, is that, and I would give you as an example. For example, last year, we didn't get bonuses because we flushed the money all the way back to the farmers. And so the priority will always be that they're going to come first in terms of getting a check. So we buy their milk at a higher price than market. So they're getting sort of a check from that. And then at the end of the year, they get sort of their patronage, and it's the highest we could possibly provide them back. Now, Is that enough? No, right? Are we extremely concerned with how rural America is doing and how farmers are doing? Very, 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 very concerned, right? And so the fact that um, death by suicide is the #1 cause of death of farmers is very concerning. And COVID was something where we were literally having daily. So Allison, you might appreciate this. We were having daily executive calls with the CEO all the way through all the VPs, like daily, through COVID, because we knew that these folks were struggling to get their milk out because the trucks weren't moving, right? And so to have a farmer have to make milk and then dump it on the field, which none of ours had to do, but many did have to do, or have to escort their baby pigs to a field and frankly kill them because they knew they couldn't afford to feed them because they weren't going to get shipped out, is extremely painful for these folks. And so it's very top of mind, particularly our CEO, that's our ultimate job, is to make sure we can provide value back to them. Again, to the point of if we've had to say as employees we're not going to get a bonus this year because we're flowing that back, we'll do that. And so you have to feel good about that because that's our role ultimately. When we're not really a CPG, right? So part of what we do is CPG-esque, but then there's this foundation of but those guys come first and they own us, right? So that's a big question.
Well, I think that's an often unknown fact about Land O'Lakes, as people think about it as the butter company, when in fact dairy foods is sometimes the smallest portion of the entire Land O'Lakes portfolio. And in that vein, I know you mentioned Truterra earlier, and a lot of the work Land O'Lakes does on farms that aren't just dairy farms. And I'm curious if there's any innovations you can speak to in that realm and progress there. We had a great conversation with Stephen Rosenzweig from General Mills yesterday, talking about their Regenerative Ag program. Obviously, we need to move from just maintaining the land to regenerating it to safely avoid a lot of the risks we're seeing from climate change and things like that. If you would like to speak to any of the work and innovation on that side of the business, I think that would be great to hear.
We're trying to use some tools that we have to try to at least minimize the damage. And we've been at this point of how do you minimize the damage and how do you minimize how many chemicals, how much stuff you're putting on the land, right? So we have satellite images, and you can look at all sorts of different ways in which the land is, a given field is, and how you're going to water it, and how you're going to put pesticides on it, and how you're going to fertilize it, and how you're going to do all that. And then we start looking at some math that they do to help you calculate kind of what is your footprint and give farmers a way to make their footprint low and low and low and kind of give them a glide path to get there if they choose to take that. And those are good small steps at some point, right? And so you got to start, incrementally from where you are today. But then from the other side, looking back in, conversations like, if you think about it, I think it's like 44% of all calories consumed in the United States come from 3 crops. So rice, wheat, and corn. If you track all the way back to their feed, like 44% or something, three. And so if one of those things gets knocked out, right, it's not a very stable, but knowing that there's so many species out there, especially if we think of mushrooms. And so we start to talk about a little bit tiptoeing into what if those of us that are not the dairy farmers, but those of us that own us that are farmers that have crops, how would one transition into a healthier rotation of crops into a different, right? Because that would help as well. And so we're starting to tiptoe into that, but it's an interesting dynamic where we may know things we know, but then we're owned by people that frankly have a heavily invested a certain way. And so how do we help the folks that are in the traditional ag transition into what might be regenerative, right? All these new things that are coming that we know are important, but it's hard when you have a few $1 million invested in your family farm. And we come in saying, yeah, that's probably not what you should be doing next year. Right. So we tiptoe through that. Like, how do we do that?
Love it. I think that's really important. The biodiversity aspect is becoming really critical on farm. And I know there was one of our sessions yesterday, the Forever Green initiative was mentioned, who are working on perennial crops like kernza and pennycress and others. And so there's a lot of great work going on about how can we incorporate those crops, which can actually regenerate topsoil and help sustain our farming ag industry. We have another question in here. I'm intrigued by all the wonderful work done by Venture 37 in terms of global food insecurity. What is the role of, of innovation in the international development work at Land O'Lakes?
So a lot of the work that we're doing is fairly close to the ground. It's not sort of this huge innovation, right? So these are folks that need very simple things sometimes, right? So a very simple solution to an issue that they're having around, like how do I get funding? How do I, right? That's easier for us to support. And so my team isn't heavily involved. What we do often have, and I think Allison, you had an interest in it at some point maybe, where occasionally we have, and I know Georgia, the country Georgia, had some questions back where they do ask occasionally for, say, a quality person, and they have once or twice asked for like an R&D person to help them think through how do they build an innovation pipeline. So sometimes we have a couple of kind of our partners there that are a little bit further along, that they're ready to start thinking of things like, how do I create an innovation pipeline? How should I think about this? But often it's very sort of, how do they deal with the government? How do they, their government, how do they deal with their regulations? So there's this, and it's very rewarding for the folks that are closer in with it. I wouldn't say that my team is the closest in with it, but it's very rewarding to be able to help folks like that with and General Mills has something similar to Partners in Food Solutions, I think it's called, where they do kind of that kind of work as well. But it's certainly not something that we forget, and it's something that we do spend some time, even with the Bill Gates Foundation, I understand, to help kind of really small farmers kind of be successful.
I want to pivot back quickly to innovation in the framework of, and you mentioned it earlier, the kind of regulations, or the CFR, the Code of Federal Regulations around what is butter, what is cheese, and how those things impact product development. And I found it really entertaining. I believe it was, I don't know if it was, I can't believe it's not butter. It wasn't that one, because that one wouldn't be the name, but there was a margarine or spread brand that renamed it as plant-based butter, which was technically accurate, but really stealing on the health halo. And knowing that, scientists can be hindered by what fits into that. I know for butter, if you want to add, herbs or flavorings in there, then you have to call it this with those things. And knowing that consumers seem more open to kind of flexible definitions, right, and smaller brands are able to get away with naming things butter, even if they are technically not by that CFR code. How your team is thinking about those things and maybe formulating or developing differently to, sneak those things in where it's still being honest with the consumer, but being able to be more flexible with that.
Yeah, it's true that we're certainly held to a different standard, right? You certainly have a different standard when you're a different size, and I don't know that that's necessarily wrong, just so you can't go pound, people over the head with things that might, you don't want to have a certain degree of power and then not be held sort of to tighter guidelines. However, I do agree that some of these definitions, sometimes you can take advantage of them in ways that are not, you can use your power for evil or use your power for good, kind of thing, right? And we do struggle with that quite a bit. We do struggle with antiquated definitions of cheese and butter, and when really I'm not sure consumers care. And in some instances, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be unhealthy, right? Now, is it true that if you call something, a margarine like a plant-based whatever, and it makes it sound like I just had a salad when I put that on my toast, So it's an interesting conundrum. One would argue that the Impossible Burger, plant-based burger, is a feat of science, because it is, rather than somebody took some vegetables and they smushed it up and then they made a patty out of it, right? It's fascinating, right? So it's not food engineered. It's very food engineered, and yet it's plant-based. And so I think that, but I think consumers are getting smart about that. Good, which is good. But they're getting smart about plant-based versus engineered versus my values around how animals are treated, which also plays quite a bit here with how I'm impacting the environment. And so we're trying to dissect where again, when it's trying to stay in touch with the consumer, what do they really care about? Because in some instances, folks might say, I'll eat an engineered food if I'm helping the climate, because I'm not afraid of it, right? And so is that what's driving things? Is that right? It's really, so in terms of our innovation, it's really kind of trying to learn what is it that's driving this still.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Well, I will let you leave any parting words before I close out. Any final words on innovation or looking at things differently that you want to send out to our audience today?
The more of you that do this, the better everybody is. Seriously. The more of you that are sort of thinking outside the box and trying to get something out there in front of consumers, you're going to make everybody else better. And it's just exciting to see it.
Awesome. All right. Well,